A single dad took in two homeless kids, and 20 years later, they moved heaven and earth to stop his death sentence. But what you're about to discover will shake you to your core, because sometimes the very act of saving someone's life can destroy your own. The judge's gavel echoed through the packed courtroom like thunder. "Mr. Hayes, you have been found guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, murder in the first degree, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit sexual assault against a child." Robert's head remained bowed. He had heard these words before, 2 years ago, but they still felt like physical blows. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame. A man who had once been strong and hopeful, now reduced to skin and bones by years of imprisonment and a justice system that had failed him spectacularly. "The sentence is death by lethal injection, to be carried out at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Reporters scribbled frantically. Television cameras captured every angle of what appeared to be justice served. But if they had looked closer, if they had seen past the surface of this condemned man, they might have noticed something the prosecution had missed entirely. In Robert's eyes, there was no guilt, only a deep, bone-crushing sadness that spoke of a man who had spent his entire life trying to help others, only to find himself branded as a monster. You see, Robert Hayes wasn't supposed to be here. He was a man who had already lost everything that mattered to him, not once, but twice. And now he was about to lose his life for a crime he didn't commit.
November 15th, 2 years ago. Robert was walking home from his late shift at Morrison Hardware, his collar turned up against the bitter cold. At 54, his joints ached more than they used to, and the 15-block walk to the only 24-hour pharmacy in town felt like a marathon. But he was out of his heart medication, and missing even one dose could be dangerous. The neighborhood got rougher as he walked deeper into downtown. Broken streetlights cast long shadows between abandoned buildings and empty lots. Most people avoided this area after dark, but Robert had learned long ago that sometimes you had to walk through the darkness to reach what you needed. That's when he saw it. Riverside Elementary School sat like a lonely brick fortress in the rain, its windows dark except for one. A single classroom light glowed on the second floor, and the side door, the one that should have been locked tight, stood slightly ajar, rain blowing into the hallway. Robert paused on the sidewalk, water dripping from his worn baseball cap. Something was wrong. Schools didn't stay open this late, especially not with doors left open in weather like this. His first thought was simple concern. Had a janitor forgotten to lock up? Was there a break-in happening? Robert had volunteered at enough schools to know how vulnerable these buildings were to vandalism and theft.
He approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing off the wet pavement. "Hello," he called out, his voice nearly swallowed by the storm. "Is someone there? The door's open." No response. Robert pulled out his phone to call the police, but the screen remained black. Dead battery. Of course. He stood there for a moment, rain soaking through his jacket, weighing his options. The smart thing would be to walk away, find a working phone, let someone else deal with it. But then he heard it. Faint, almost lost in the storm, but unmistakable. A child's voice, crying, pleading. Every parental instinct Robert had ever possessed, instincts he thought had died years ago, suddenly roared to life. Without another moment's hesitation, he stepped through the open door. The hallway was eerily quiet, except for that sound, growing clearer now. It was coming from below, from what had to be the basement. Robert's heart pounded, as he followed the sound down a corridor lined with cheerful student artwork that seemed grotesquely out of place in the darkness. The basement stairs creaked under his weight. Each step took him deeper into what felt like a nightmare, but he couldn't turn back. Not when a child was in danger. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a partially open door. Through the crack, Robert saw something that made his blood turn to ice. A man in dark clothing had cornered a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, in what appeared to be a maintenance room.
The child was pressed against the far wall, tears streaming down her face, and the man was advancing toward her with intentions that were sickeningly clear. "Please, mister," the little girl sobbed. "I want to go home. I want my mommy." The man, Robert would later learn his name was Marcus Webb, reached for the child's arm. "Your mommy can't help you now, sweetheart." "Hey!" Robert roared, slamming through the door with all the force he could muster. "Get away from her!" Webb spun around, his eyes wide with shock and rage. For a split second, the room was frozen in tableau. The terrified child, the predator caught in the act, and Robert Hayes, who had stumbled into the middle of a nightmare. "You shouldn't have come down here, old man," Webb snarled, grabbing a heavy wrench from a nearby toolbox. What happened next occurred in a blur of violence and desperation. Webb lunged at Robert with the wrench raised high. Robert, despite his age and the heart condition that had been slowly killing him for years, managed to dodge and grab a piece of broken pipe to defend himself. They struggled violently in the cramped space. Webb was younger and stronger, but Robert was fighting for something more important than his own life. He was fighting for that little girl cowering in the corner. The wrench caught Robert across the temple, sending him staggering backward, blood streaming down his face. For a moment, his vision went black, and he thought this was it. He was going to die in this basement, and that monster was going to hurt the child. But sometimes, when everything seems lost, adrenaline can make miracles happen.
Robert swung the pipe with every ounce of strength he had left. It connected with Webb's shoulder, sending the predator stumbling backward directly into a bank of exposed electrical panels. The impact caused Webb to convulse as electricity coursed through his body. He collapsed, hitting his head on the concrete floor with a sound Robert would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. Webb didn't get up. Robert, bleeding and disoriented, immediately went to the child. "It's okay," he whispered, trying to keep his voice gentle despite the horror of what had just happened. "You're safe now. What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sophie," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "Sophie Chen. Where's my mommy? The bad man said he hurt my mommy." Robert's heart broke. He pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around Sophie's small shoulders, trying to shield her from the sight of Webb's motionless body. "We're gonna find your mommy, okay? But first we need to get you out of here." But by the time Robert was coherent enough to think clearly, sirens were already wailing outside. Someone had seen the lights and called the police about a possible break-in. What the arriving officers found looked damning beyond belief. Robert Hayes, a man with no fixed address who had been drifting from city to city for years, standing over a dead body in a school basement with an abducted child whose parents had been found murdered in their home just hours earlier. The blood on Robert's clothes, the pipe in his hands, a traumatized 8-year-old girl who was too shocked to give coherent testimony about what really happened.
To the police, to the prosecutors, to the media, it looked like an open and shut case. 2 monsters had targeted the Chen family. One killed the parents while the other took care of the child. When they disagreed about something, maybe Webb wanted to keep Sophie for himself, Robert had killed his partner to silence him. "Mr. Hayes," Detective Morrison had said that first night in the interrogation room, "we know you did it. We have your fingerprints on the murder weapon. We have the victim's blood on your clothes. We have you at the scene with the kidnapped child." Robert had tried to explain. He'd told them about hearing Sophie's cries, about finding Webb attacking her, about fighting to save her life. But who was going to believe the word of a homeless drifter over the physical evidence? If you were trying to save her, the detective pressed, why didn't you call the police? My phone was dead. I heard her crying and I couldn't wait. Convenient. And I suppose you just happened to be walking by an elementary school at midnight in the pouring rain. I was going to the pharmacy for my medication. I can show you the prescription. But they weren't interested in prescriptions or explanations. They had their narrative, and it fit the evidence perfectly. The trial had been a nightmare. Robert's court-appointed attorney, fresh out of law school and overwhelmed by the complexity of a capital case, had pushed him to take a plea bargain. Life in prison instead of death. It's the best deal you're going to get.
But Robert couldn't accept it. How could he plead guilty to harming a child when everything in his being had been focused on protecting her? "I won't lie about this," he had told his attorney. "I saved that little girl's life. I may die for it, but I won't pretend I hurt her." The prosecutor had painted a horrific picture for the jury. They spoke of a conspiracy between Robert and Marcus Webb, a partnership in evil that had targeted innocent families. They presented Robert's nomadic lifestyle as evidence that he was avoiding law enforcement, moving from city to escape detection. What they didn't know, what wouldn't be discovered until much later, was that Marcus Webb had been operating under false identities for years. He wasn't just a school janitor who had gone bad. He was a serial predator who had been targeting families across multiple states, killing parents and taking children. But Webb's real criminal history was hidden behind layers of false documents and fake identities. The background check that had gotten him hired at Riverside Elementary had missed everything. The jury had deliberated for only 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. The penalty phase took another day, and again they were swift: death by lethal injection. For 2 years, Robert had sat on death row, haunted not just by his own fate, but by the knowledge that somewhere out there, Sophie Chen was trying to rebuild her life after losing her parents and being traumatized by the very event he had tried to prevent. He wrote letters to Sophie's surviving relatives, trying to explain what had really happened. But his lawyers advised against sending them. "It will look like you're trying to manipulate witnesses," they warned.
What Robert didn't know was that Sophie Chen, now 10 years old and living with her grandparents, had been slowly recovering her memories with the help of trauma therapy. The night in the basement had been so terrifying that her mind had fragmented the experience, mixing up the timeline and the people involved. But as she healed, as she grew stronger, the truth began to emerge. Sophie remembered 2 men in the basement, one who had scared her, who had said terrible things about her parents, and another who had shouted at the scary man to get away from her. She remembered feeling safer when the second man appeared. She remembered him wrapping his coat around her shoulders and speaking gently to her while they waited for the police. But a traumatized child's recovered memories, even true ones, weren't enough to stop an execution. Now, as Robert sat in that courtroom listening to his death sentence being confirmed, he had no idea that 200 miles away, 2 women were racing through traffic in a desperate attempt to save his life. Anna and Grace Fletcher, now Anna Whitmore and Grace Brooks, had been searching for Robert Hayes for 20 years. They had hired private investigators, searched public records, and followed countless dead-end leads. They had been 10 years old when they last saw him, and now they were successful 30-year-old women who had never forgotten the man who had saved their lives. Anna had become an artist, her work often featuring themes of rescue and redemption. She was married to Charles Whitmore, the CEO of a major marketing firm, and they had twin toddlers who would never know how close they came to losing their grandfather.
Grace had fulfilled her childhood dream of becoming a lawyer. She specialized in helping the vulnerable and forgotten, inspired by her own experience of being homeless and helpless until Robert found her. She was married to Dr. Samuel Brooks, a pediatrician, and they had a newborn son who would grow up hearing stories about the man who had taught their mother what love looked like. The twins had spent years trying to find Robert, But their search had gone cold when he began moving from city to city. They had no idea that his nomadic lifestyle wasn't about running from the law, it was about running from the memories of losing them. It wasn't until Grace saw a news report about the upcoming execution that their world turned upside down. "Anna," Grace had called, her voice shaking as she stared at the television screen. "Anna, you need to see this, right now." The news report showed a grainy courtroom sketch of a man sentenced to death for multiple murders and child abduction. The name was different, Michael Hayes instead of the Robert Hayes they remembered, but the face, aged though it was unmistakably their father. The man who had taken them in from the rain, who had given them their first taste of unconditional love, who had searched for them desperately when they disappeared, was sitting on death row for crimes he could never have committed. "This is impossible," Anna had whispered. "He wouldn't hurt anyone, especially not a child." "I know, which means we have less than 48 hours to prove it."
What followed was a frantic investigation that made use of every resource, every connection, every favor the twins could call in. Grace's law firm put their best investigators on the case. Charles used his marketing company's research capabilities to dig into Marcus Webb's background. Dr. Brooks used his medical connections to review the physical evidence. What they found was staggering. Marcus Webb wasn't who he claimed to be. He was actually Martin Walsh, a registered sex offender who had been operating under false identities for years. He had worked at schools in 3 different states, always managing to fool background checks with sophisticated false documents. More importantly, Webb had left behind a pattern of similar crimes. Families in Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania had been targeted in identical ways. Parents killed during home invasions, children taken and later found dead. In every case, Webb had been working at a nearby school under a false identity. Sophie Chen had been intended as his next victim, but Robert's intervention had broken the pattern and ended Webb's killing spree. The evidence was overwhelming, but getting it heard was another matter entirely. With less than 12 hours until the execution, Grace had to move mountains to get an emergency hearing. That's why, as Robert sat in the courthouse, expecting to hear his final appeals denied, he had no idea that his daughters were about to burst through those doors with enough evidence to prove his innocence. The morning of November 15th, exactly 2 years after the night that had destroyed his life, Robert woke in his death row cell with a strange sense of peace. He had spent the night thinking about all the people he had loved and lost. He thought about his wife, Catherine, and his son, Thomas, killed in a car accident that had shattered his world decades ago.
He thought about Anna and Grace, the twin girls he had pulled from the rain and loved as his own daughters, who had disappeared from his life when they were just 10 years old. If today was his last day, at least he would die knowing he had tried to help people, even if it had ultimately cost him everything. The transport to the courthouse was routine. Robert had made this trip many times over the past 2 years for various appeals and hearings. He no longer bothered to look out the windows of the prison van or to hope that somehow, miraculously, justice would prevail. The courtroom was packed when they brought him in. Reporters, curiosity seekers, a few protesters from both sides of the death penalty debate. Robert barely looked up as he was led to his seat, resigned to his fate. Judge Harrison was known for his efficiency and his reluctance to grant last-minute stays of execution. This hearing was expected to be a formality, a final rejection of appeals that would clear the way for the 6 p.m. execution. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Harrison began, "your attorneys have filed several last-minute appeals, all of which have been reviewed and, Your Honor." The voice came from the back of the courtroom, cutting through the proceedings like a lightning bolt. Robert's head snapped up, and what he saw made his heart stop. 2 women were standing at the back of the courtroom, both professionally dressed, both carrying thick folders of documents. One had the bearing of someone accustomed to courtrooms and legal battles. The other had the elegant presence of someone who understood the power of visual presentation. But what made Robert's hands begin to shake was that he would have recognized those faces anywhere, despite the 20 years that had passed. Anna, Grace, his daughters.
"Your Honor," the woman with the legal bearing said, striding down the aisle with confidence, "I am Grace Brooks, attorney for Mr. Hayes. We have new evidence that will prove Mr. Hayes's innocence." The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Reporters were shouting questions, cameras were flashing, and Robert sat frozen in his chair, unable to process what was happening. "Miss Brooks," Judge Harrison said sharply, "this court was not informed that Mr. Hayes had retained new counsel. The retention was finalized at 6 a.m. this morning, Your Honor. All appropriate paperwork has been filed with the court clerk." Grace moved with the precision of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. Behind her, Anna took a seat in the front row, her eyes never leaving Robert's face. "Your Honor," Grace continued, "the evidence we are presenting today will show that Marcus Webb, the man who died in the school basement, was actually Martin Walsh, a serial killer who had been targeting families across multiple states for years. Mr. Hayes didn't conspire with Webb. He stopped him." The next several hours felt like a dream to Robert. He watched in stunned silence as Grace methodically dismantled the case against him. She presented evidence of Webb's real identity and criminal history. She showed the pattern of similar murders across multiple states, all connected to schools where Webb had worked under false identities. She brought in expert witnesses who testified about the physical evidence, showing that Robert's injuries were consistent with defending himself, not attacking someone. But the most powerful testimony came from Anna.
"Your Honor," Anna said, taking the witness stand with quiet dignity, "I need to tell you about the man you're about to execute." Her voice was steady, but tears streamed down her face as she spoke. 20 years ago, my sister Grace and I were living on the streets. We were 10 years old, homeless, hungry, and terrified. Robert Hayes found us during a November storm, huddled under a piece of cardboard, and he saved our lives. Anna's testimony painted a picture of Robert that was completely at odds with the monster the prosecution had portrayed. She spoke of a man who had already lost his own family, but who opened his heart and home to 2 frightened children. "This man taught us what kindness looked like," Anna continued, pointing to Robert, who sat with tears streaming down his face. "He showed us that there were still good people in the world. He loved us like he was our own daughters, and we loved him like he was our father. The idea that this man could hurt a child isn't just wrong, it's impossible. Everything he ever did was about protecting people, especially children who had nowhere else to turn." Grace followed with more testimony, describing the months they had lived with Robert, the way he had made them feel safe and valued for the first time in their lives. She also revealed the crushing guilt they had carried for 20 years. "We left him when we were 10, Grace said, her courtroom demeanor cracking slightly. "Robert was sick, and we thought we were making him sicker by being there. So we ran away, thinking we were helping him. We were just children who didn't understand that sometimes the people we love get sick, and it's not our fault.
We spent 20 years looking for him, trying to find him so we could tell him we were sorry, so we could thank him for everything he gave us. We never imagined we'd find him here, facing death for a crime he could never have committed." But the most damning evidence against the original prosecution came from the private investigators Grace had hired. Working around the clock for the past 48 hours, they had uncovered Webb's true criminal history and the sophisticated network of false identities he had used to evade detection. "Your Honor," Grace said, presenting a thick file of evidence, "Martin Walsh, operating under the identity of Marcus Webb, was responsible for the murders of at least 12 people across 4 states. He specifically targeted families where he could gain access to children through his employment at local schools. The evidence showed that in every case, Walsh had killed the parents during home invasion robberies, then taken the children to secluded locations where he assaulted and murdered them. Sophie Chen was meant to be his next victim, but Robert's intervention had saved her life and ended Walsh's killing spree. The prosecution's theory that Mr. Hayes was Walsh's partner falls apart completely when you look at Walsh's actual pattern," Grace continued.
He never worked with partners. He was a lone predator who had been successfully avoiding detection for years. The most heartbreaking testimony came from Sophie Chen herself, now 12 years old and much stronger thanks to years of therapy. Her grandparents had brought her to court, and she took the stand with a composure that belied her young age. "I remember that night," Sophie said quietly. "There were 2 men in the basement. One was scary, and he said bad things about my parents. The other man," she pointed to Robert, "he told the scary man to get away from me. I was scared until he came. When he wrapped his coat around me and told me I was safe, I believed him. He didn't hurt me. He saved me." Sophie's clear, honest testimony about what she now remembered from that night was devastating to the prosecution's case. Her recovered memories, supported by extensive therapy records and expert testimony about childhood trauma, painted a picture completely opposite to what had been presented at trial. As the evidence mounted, as witness after witness testified to Robert's character and to the real truth about what had happened that night, the courtroom atmosphere shifted dramatically. What had begun as a routine final hearing before an execution was turning into something unprecedented. Judge Harrison, known for his stern demeanor and strict adherence to procedure, listened to everything with increasing concern. When the last witness finished testifying, he called for a recess to review the evidence. Robert sat in stunned silence during the break, still unable to fully process what was happening. Anna and Grace approached him during the recess, and for the first time in 20 years, father and daughters were in the same room. "I looked for you everywhere," Robert whispered, his voice breaking. "We know," Anna replied, taking his shackled hands in hers. "We were looking for you too. We never stopped loving you. You saved our lives, and we couldn't save yours in time. But we're here now." The embrace that followed was 20 years in the making. Despite the shackles and the orange jumpsuit, despite the courthouse setting and the media frenzy outside, in that moment they were simply a father and his daughters, reunited against impossible odds. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison's expression was grave. He had clearly been deeply affected by what he had heard. "In 30 years on this bench," he began, "I have never seen a case quite like this one. The evidence presented today raises serious questions not just about Mr. Hayes' guilt, but about how our justice system failed so spectacularly in this case." He paused, looking directly at Robert. "Mr. Hayes, the evidence suggests that you were not a participant in the crimes that occurred that night. Rather, you appear to have been a hero who risked your own life to save a child from a monster." The courtroom was completely silent. "In light of this new evidence, and given the questions it raises about the original investigation and trial, all charges against you are hereby dismissed. "Mr. Hayes, you are free to go." The courtroom exploded. Reporters rushed for phones and laptops. Cameras flashed continuously. Protesters outside began chanting. But Robert heard none of it. He was focused entirely on Anna and Grace, who were rushing toward him with tears streaming down their faces. The bailiffs unlocked his shackles, and for the first time in 2 years, Robert was able to embrace his daughters as a free man. The media frenzy that followed was intense, but Robert barely noticed. He was too busy learning about the women Anna and Grace had become, meeting their husbands, seeing pictures of Anna's twin toddlers, his grandchildren, and Grace's newborn son.
Charles Whitmore, Anna's husband, immediately offered Robert a position with his marketing company, though Robert wasn't sure he was ready to think about the future yet. Dr. Brooks, Grace's husband, insisted on giving him a complete medical examination and arranging for treatment for the health issues that had gone untreated during his incarceration. But more than jobs or medical care, what Robert needed was time. Time to process what had happened. Time to heal from the trauma of nearly being executed for a crime he didn't commit, and time to rebuild relationships with the two people who had never stopped being his daughters. The three of them spent hours talking, filling in the gaps of 20 years. Anna showed him her artwork, paintings that often featured themes of rescue and kindness during storms. Many of her pieces, Robert realized, had been inspired by memories of him. Grace told him about the legal cases she had taken on, always gravitating toward helping the vulnerable and forgotten, the people who reminded her of who she and Anna had been before Robert found them. "You taught us to care about people who had nowhere else to turn," Grace explained one evening as they sat in her living room, Robert holding his grandson for the first time. "You taught us to care about people who had nowhere else to turn. Everything we became because of what you showed us." "I thought I had failed you," Robert admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I let you down by getting sick, by not being able to take care of you properly." "You didn't fail us," Anna said firmly from her seat on the couch, her own children playing at her feet. "You gave us the most important gift anyone can give a child. You made us feel worthy of love."
As the weeks passed and the immediate chaos of the trial and media attention began to settle, Robert began to understand that this wasn't just a story about a wrongful conviction overturned or a family reunited. It was a story about the ripple effects of kindness, about how one act of compassion on a stormy night could echo through decades and ultimately save the very person who had first extended help. The investigation into Robert's case had exposed massive flaws in the background check systems used by schools across multiple states. Reform legislation, dubbed the Sophie Chen Child Protection Act, was introduced in Congress to close the loopholes that had allowed Martin Walsh to operate undetected for so many years. 6 months after his release, Robert stood in the same courthouse where he had nearly lost his life, but this time he was there for a celebration. Grace was being honored by the State Bar Association for her work on wrongful conviction cases, inspired by her experience with Robert's case and her determination to prevent other innocent people from facing what he had endured. Anna was there too, her latest painting on display in the courthouse lobby, a work called Redemption that showed figures emerging from darkness into light, hands reaching for each other across an impossible divide. As Robert watched his daughters receive recognition for their achievements, he realized that the story was still being written. The stormy night 20 years ago, when he had found 2 frightened children, wasn't the end of his ability to love and be loved. It was the beginning of something larger than he had ever imagined. In saving Anna and Grace, he had saved himself. In losing them, he had learned the true depth of parental love. And in being found by them, he had discovered that family isn't just about blood relations or legal documents. It's about people who refuse to give up on each other, no matter how much time passes or how impossible the odds seem. The case also led to the exoneration of 2 other men in different states who had been wrongfully convicted of crimes actually committed by Martin Walsh. Robert's story had become a catalyst for justice that extended far beyond his own situation. Robert now spends his time speaking at law schools and criminal justice conferences, telling his story and advocating for reforms that could prevent other innocent people from facing what he endured. He also volunteers with organizations that help exonerees readjust to life after wrongful conviction, using his experience to guide others through the difficult process of rebuilding their lives. But perhaps the most meaningful part of Robert's new life is simply being a grandfather. Anna's twins, now 4 years old, call him Grandpa Bob and have no idea how close they came to losing him before they ever met him. Grace's son, now 18 months old, reaches for Robert whenever he sees him, instinctively trusting the man his mother has told him so much about. On quiet Sunday afternoons, when the whole family gathers at Anna's house for dinner, Robert sometimes catches himself marveling at the impossible journey that brought them all together. 2 frightened children found in the rain, 2 decades of separation and searching, a wrongful conviction that nearly cost him his life, and finally, a reunion that proved the unbreakable power of love. The rain still falls, just as it did 20 years ago when Robert first found Anna and Grace, just as it did 2 years ago when he saved Sophie Chen's life. But Robert no longer sees rain as a harbinger of tragedy. Now it reminds him that sometimes the stormiest nights bring the most precious gifts. It reminds him that families can be broken and reformed, that love can survive decades of separation, and that sometimes the people you save end up saving you right back.
Have you ever wondered what happens when kindness meets tragedy, when love refuses to give up, even when all hope seems lost? This is what happens. Miracles disguised as ordinary people doing extraordinary things for each other. As Robert sits in his living room on rainy nights now, surrounded by photos of his daughters and grandchildren, he knows that his story isn't unique. Across the world, there are people extending kindness to strangers, families being separated and reunited, innocent people facing injustice, and love finding a way to triumph over the impossible. If this story has touched your heart, if it's reminded you of the power we all have to make a difference in someone's life, then share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Share it with someone who needs to know that families can be found in the most unexpected places and that love really can conquer everything. Because sometimes the family you choose becomes the one that chooses to save you. And sometimes a single act of kindness on a stormy night can echo through the decades and change the world. Robert Hayes knows this better than anyone. 20 years ago, he opened his door to 2 homeless children, and they grew up to move heaven and earth to save his life. This is the power of love. This is the miracle of family. This is proof that no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever truly forgotten. The rain may fall, but love endures. Justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied. And families, real families, built on love and sacrifice, will always find their way back to each other. This is the story of how a single dad took in 2 homeless kids, and 20 years later, they stopped his death sentence. But more than that, it's a story about all of us, about the choices we make when we see someone in need, about the families we build beyond biology, and about the faith we keep that love will always find a way. What will your story be?